Hey folks, Ryan Gill here with Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire to help others accomplish their own primitive building and hunting goals. Thanks for joining us today on an episode of Secrets in Science Chapters, where we go through and break down individual chapters from the Secrets in Science collection of books. This week's episode of the Secrets in Science Chapters, we're going to talk about penetration and shot placement. And before I get started on this, I also want to let you know that I know folks are probably going to want a lot more of these chapters explained. So we're going to have like a updated blog channel. Every time I do one of these videos, I'll put it on the website and I'll put a link to it on the homepage of huntprimitive.com. You can also find it in the menu, but I'll put it on the homepage. And then every one of these that we do, going chapter by chapter, you'll be able to catch up. So if you do get started on some of these later, you could probably just go and then look at all the ones we've done, see if any pertain to you, or watch them all, whatever. But anyway, today we're going to talk about penetration and shot placement. So let's read a little bit going through this. This subject is crucial in both efficacy and contextual hunting scenarios, but far too often overlooked and needs a chapter dedicated to its true importance. Being a professional primitive hunter, and understanding of shot placement comes natural to me. However, I often forget that many people today are not remotely familiar with the need for proper shot placement and sufficient penetration. Without those key components, penetration tests performed on carcasses are moot. I have often seen carcass tests performed and deemed successful in recording impact data from a projectile that didn't even hit a vital area. And that seems like raw basic information to me, yet after witnessing this multiple times, it's vital to discuss how it relates to true contextual hunting and the recovering of animals. This is clearly a subject that needs a lot more attention than I ever once realized. And that's how I begin that chapter. And so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next paragraph because it'll start to really pull it all together. And that starts by saying, in quotations, if you hit them, they will die. Or the idea of get an arrow in them, run them and track them down, shoot them multiple times, basically pin cushioning them. These theories are not practical or dependable methods for hunting once you've actually tried them. But this is something that I hear about all the time. People think, well, you don't have to like really make good shots. The early people, they were better than that. They just slung arrows, and as long as they hit it, they could hit it in the ankle, and they could track it down, and they could find it. And boy, could not possibly be more wrong in that. But let's read a little bit more, and then we'll go back and cover it. So, many are under the assumption that simply getting an arrow into an animal will eventually kill them. So the most critical part in early man's eyes was to simply launch ineffective and inefficient projectiles in the spray and pray technique. Trust me, I have heard them all. Indians had to shoot animals multiple times, pin cushioning them to death, or they were much better trackers than us today, so all they had to do was hit an animal anywhere, and they could track it for 3 days and recover it. Now, there are undoubtedly situations where long tracking jobs and multiple shots come into play. There are times that bad shots happen, and you may have a day or two's worth of tracking until you recover the animal. And any experienced hunter will tell you that every scenario can and will play out eventually. So you will make a bad shot eventually. You will get insufficient penetration. You'll make a mistake and you'll learn from it. You'll hit a branch and deflect an arrow, whatever. But those aforementioned techniques of saying, all I have to do is hit that animal and I'm going to run it down and get it, that could not be more horribly wrong in the opposite direction, because more times than not, bad shots result in losing the animal, not tracking them for 3 days. And I'll tell you what, tracking wounded animals, especially ones that just have a flesh wound, you're never going to find them because they're going to heal up and you're never going to catch up with them, ever. Ever. I promise you. You make a flesh wound, hit them on the shoulder with no penetration, hit them in the leg, just hit meat, hit them high above the spine, you'll never see that animal again. I promise you will never recover that animal. So, rather than relying on the aforementioned, early people relied on their brains and honed, refined building and shot placement skills. That means making highly effective equipment. So we're not just building haphazard. People sometimes get offended with the word primitive, and they're like, well, that's derogatory, and you shouldn't say primitive and this and that. It's like primitive just means absent of modern technology. But that doesn't mean that it's haphazard and crude and they're just slinging arrows. That's not what it means at all. In fact, much of primitive hunting equipment is actually quite sophisticated. But that means, rather than relying on the aforementioned, earlier people relied on their brains and honed, refined building and shot placement skills. That means making highly effective equipment and delivering accurate shots to bring down animals quickly. There are many places to shoot an animal that will not kill them. In fact, I would argue there are more places on a deer that will not kill them than those that will. So bad shots that result in kills are often from getting lucky and severing a major artery. So let's talk about this a second. So we already discussed that just hitting an animal isn't enough. So shot placement is important. It's really important. I've talked to archers that are just getting started, and this could be anything from, even rifle hunters for that matter, but compound hunters. It's not exclusive to primitive hunting. This is anything that just are like, they'll see a deer, and as long as they can stick an arrow in it somewhere, they'll start celebrating and be like, I shot that one. Be like, you are probably not going to find that one that you just shot in the ankle. Like, you're probably not going to. Or they hit them high above the spine. It's just a flesh wound. There's nothing vital up there. That happens quite often, especially as the spine kind of comes across towards, we'll say that assume that the head is on this side and the butt's on this side, and the spine actually dips down between the shoulders and up, and sometimes people shoot above the spine, get full pass-through penetration, but there's actually nothing vital up there at all. And that happens with deer and elk and hogs and just about everything. But they think that, well, now that I did it, I'm just going to track it for 3 days. And they may track it and follow blood as far as they can. Realistically, probably covering less than a couple hundred yards. That animal's not even dead. So again, I have grown up hunting, and I have been through, I think, probably every situation possible. Hard to say that. I guess there's always something to learn. There's always a new situation. But I've been through more situations, especially with primitive hunting, than most people ever will. I would say put me in probably the top 98, 99% of people that have shot and tracked animals. So when you get an idea of what are good shots and what are bad shots, you can actually hit something and go, yeah, I'm not going to find that one, and you know it's going to be fine. But we typically look anyway just in case that we saw something that was incorrect. Now, if you get an arrow in any sort of vital organ area, now it doesn't necessarily mean the heart and lungs or liver, anywhere in the thoracic cavity or even the abdominal cavity, the animal almost every time will die. There are some exceptions with hogs that you can literally shoot a hog just behind the lung, so behind the shoulder a tiny bit, and I've done this, and shoot an arrow completely through it. It'll run off. It won't die. It'll be through its thoracic cavity, run off, and it will not die. It will actually survive that shot. It's a small margin of error, but I have actually put arrows through hogs that have taken it, run off, never to be found again, but then later seen on a camera, and you can literally see, because of the spots and stuff that are on it, it's the same exact hog, and you can see the cut or a wound of where I shot through it. And then that animal completely heals up. So hogs are a little bit different. I have never ever put an arrow in the thoracic or abdominal cavity of a deer and hadn't had it survive. So those I'm sure it can happen by some freak accident, but realistically, if you put it in any of the vital organ cavity, it will die. Now, most flesh wounds will not kill it. So you hit it high in the neck, but you miss the arteries, you hit it above the spine, you hit it in the shoulder, you hit it in the ham meat, that's not going to hit the artery. As long as it's not going in the thoracic or abdominal cavity, then you will probably never find that animal. It should heal up and should actually be perfectly fine. And animals dying from infection is actually, I think, less likely than you think it happens. Maybe some with more modern components that could rust or introduce something that allows it to get infected more. But when you're shooting organic stuff, say like cane arrows, wood arrows with natural sinew and pine pitch and stone, it seems like it affects the animal so much less. So you either kill it or you don't. And it almost seems to be pretty black and white as far as that's concerned. There was even an instance where I met, too long of a story to really go into too far, but I met a local game warden who was somewhat familiar with who I was. So when he realized that it was me, he said, I once shot a deer, and he told me where, and he said, and he was like, this is even before he was a game warden, but he said, I shot a deer, and when I got it home, I was grinding the meat up from the shoulder, and when we put the meat in the grinder, I heard it ting on the metal. And I was like, that was a weird sound, and they pulled it out, and they found a stone point. And he says, would you know anything about that? And I said, that's funny, because when he told me where it was, and then he showed me a picture of the buck, I knew I shot that deer. Now that was about a mile, give or take, from where I shot it, which is nothing for a deer to travel a mile. And I was like, I shot that deer, and I was able to be like, this season, opening day, it was in the morning, it was walking by, I know exactly, I was using a sugarberry arrow and one of my Osage bows, and I hit it high on the shoulder, and although I went and tracked it, I never recovered it. He killed it the next year, the following year, completely healed over, had no idea it had ever been shot, and found the stone point in the meat of the shoulder. So that is another proof and testament right there that you can shoot one and not kill it at all, period. Totally healed up and survived. Okay, so now when we talk about putting an arrow through the heart or the lungs, heart or lungs hits, we'll talk about penetration here in a little bit as well, but just talking shot placement right now, when you talk about getting something in like the heart or the lungs, or even in the thoracic cavity where you're going to have at least a sucking chest wound, which that in itself can collapse a lung in some instances if it doesn't close that up. So sometimes simply piercing the diaphragm, angling up through it. I even hit a spike one time that I hit it really, really low in the chest, like really low, and back just a tiny bit, and that sucking chest wound was actually enough to kill it surprisingly quickly. But not something that you ideally want to happen all the time. So realistically, if you get forward of the diaphragm, so anything in the heart and lungs area, you put an arrow in there, chances of your recovering that animal is probably 99%. It's so rare that you could shoot one and actually get in, not above the spine, not hit the shoulder blade and fail to penetrate, but actually stick an arrow in the thoracic cavity, in the lungs or the heart area, 99% chance that you're going to recover that animal. Even if you only get a small amount of penetration, even if you only hit one lung, it's still realistically going to kill the animal, especially something the size of a deer. Maybe something really big with a small point might be able to survive that. I don't have enough data on that. Typically I get enough penetration, I don't have to worry about that. But if you get a shot that's in the abdominal cavity, so anything through the liver is going to kill it. It's not going to kill it as fast as a lung hit will, but I typically say within an hour it's done. Because you put something through the liver, that thing bleeds, and it bleeds good. It just doesn't bring it down from a lack of oxygen or massive blood loss, like cutting an artery off of, cutting the aorta off the heart or something like that. But if you put something through the liver, very, very good chance it's going to be dead done within an hour, probably even less. You get behind that, anything that you get stomach or guts, now that you could be looking to, depending on the size of the animal and the penetration, how much laceration, you could be looking at anywhere from, let's say, 10 to 24 hours is how long that animal may run somewhere, lay up, and then die. This is where a lot of people really go wrong. If they shoot something in the guts, they think we have to just run it down and get it, run it down and get it. Well, I'll tell you right now, you put an arrow through the guts of a deer or a hog or an elk, and you're like, I'm going to run it down and get it. That's where that whole, I said the technique that I mentioned in here of let's just run it down and keep shooting it. Good luck. Even a deer that has an arrow through its guts will outrun you every time. Best thing that you can do is let it lay, come back. If you shot it in the morning, you could probably come back that evening. If you shot it in the evening, come back the following morning. Sometimes you'll find it's actually still alive, which does suck, but we're not talking about your personal ethics here. We're just talking about reality. Is sometimes it's still alive, but it's really incapacitated. You just finish it off. But more times than not, it'll be dead. And then if you don't pursue it at the time that you shot it, but let it go, typically they will go on a deer, elk further. On a deer, they'll go 200-300 yards to a thick spot. They'll bed up. They'll get up and they'll wander around a few times and bed back down. Okay? But if you let them go, they'll lay down and they'll die. And then tomorrow you can come in, or later that evening come in. You can follow the blood trail. Be diligent with it. Chances are you'll probably find it. Where people really screw up is they shoot it somewhere in the abdominal cavity that's not in the liver, and they track it too fast. They track it all the way to where it bedded down. And had they left it there, and they followed the blood right to it, to where it bedded down, they get up and it runs, and that deer will not stop. Again, it will haul butt. And by this time, its body is already starting to heal that wound. And so even though it will die, it will stop bleeding. And that's the part where most people lose the animal. So if you would have left it there, it may have gotten out of its bed and wandered 20 yards and bedded again because it's sick. It's not feeling good, but you'll recover it. But when you bust it out of that bed, they're going to go another 200, 300, 400, 500 yards under their adrenaline being chased, and they're probably going to leave almost next to no blood. Can you still recover them? Yeah, but now your tracking job just got so much harder. And that's how people most of the time lose an animal that was shot through the abdominal cavity, even though it killed the animal and they failed to recover it. But that's why we specifically say, if you have doubts about the shot that might be too far back, then you let the animal go no matter what. If you go in and chase it, there is an extremely high chance you will not recover the animal, but the animal will die. That whole dream of we're going to run it down and get it is very unlikely, unless it's the following morning or the following evening and it is really getting sick and it's really getting crippled. Then you may find it and it be very wobbly and it doesn't have the energy to run from you anymore. And then you will probably be able to run it down and pincushion it to death. So there is some plausibility to that, but typically best case scenario, leave it. Come back and recover it another day. Okay, so now let's move on and we'll talk about penetration here in just a second when I find my place again. This is a good one, so we'll have to cover this, okay? I wrote in the book and I said the ideal places to target and bring down an animal extremely fast are the heart, lung, vitals, the thoracic cavity, which we discussed that, right? So a sharp hemorrhage inducing projectile that penetrates both lungs will kill the animal in a matter of seconds, except for very large animals like a bison, which then can take maybe some minutes. Okay, so putting it through both lungs is going to kill it very, very quickly. If somebody says, I shot it right through both lungs, I know I got both lungs, but it ran, and it ran for hundreds of yards, you didn't get both lungs. I can pretty well promise you that. Now it says, thanks to Hollywood, a heart shot is also devastating, but tends to conjure thoughts of instantaneous and incapacitating results. So how much have we seen that in Hollywood? Whether it's could be an old western, it could be a modern action theme, and even think of something like Dances with Wolves as a great example. So the scene where they're running the buffalo down and they're shooting it, and it's like shoots it with one arrow and they just like die instantly and come skidding to a stop. Totally unrealistic. That doesn't happen. So even if you put an arrow perfectly through the heart, it's going to run not terribly far, but until it falls down from blood loss. So people think that whether they're like, if you would hit it right in the heart, it's dead like that. I mean, how many idiots have commented on my YouTube channel going, you missed the heart. You said you hit the heart. If you missed the heart, it would have died right there. It would have got X's in its eyes, and its tongue would have stuck out, and its feet would have been straight up in the air. Dead. And it's like, that's not how it works. In fact, you can watch this video. This was a shot completely through the heart of the deer. Now, if you watch it, you'll notice that it only runs about 50 yards, 40, 50 yards, stops, and it's like, uh-oh, and then starts flopping and all that, and it's dead. Happens in a matter of seconds. That is a heart shot on something like a deer or a hog. Now, something like the bison, I'll show you this too. Many of you have probably seen this video where we threw an atlatl and put it through the heart of a bison. But a bison's such a big animal that even though this animal had a spear through its heart, through the whole thoracic cavity, through the heart and into the opposite shoulder, that animal still stood there and stood its ground, fighting until a few more minutes passed that I came up and I put another spear in its lungs, and then within a few more minutes it was done. But then that second shot, it was so incapacitated from the first shot that's why the second shot reaction wasn't very great. It just kind of went, ugh, and then walked around a little bit because it couldn't take off and run. I mean, it was really dead on its feet. We put the second shot in it through the lungs to bring it down faster. But that shows you that even a shot completely through the heart, which you can even see in that documentary, when we pulled the heart out of the bison, that the foreshaft of the spear was completely through the heart and it was still up and alive. So just hitting the heart doesn't kill it instantaneously. What they're thinking of is if you shoot something in the head and you hit the brain, that's when it goes down. But we're not aiming for that because that's protected by a hard layer of skull. And it's a relatively small target that tends to move a lot more than anything else. So that was a really good thing to point out, because Hollywood makes us think that as soon as you hit something in the heart, it's going to go down and die immediately, and that is not true. Alright, so now penetration. Penetration is extremely important in regards to a fast kill and recovery. An arrow that hits perfectly in the thoracic cavity and only penetrates about 3 inches will result in a single lung hit. That single lung hit will require, we did talk about this earlier, will require a much lengthier and tougher tracking job. And that the reason for that is when you hit that one lung, it still is drawing oxygen into the bloodstream from the opposite lung. And very, very high likelihood that it will not recover from that. It will eventually die, but it will go, could potentially go 300 to 600 yards on a single lung hit, where if you get both lungs, it's going to go 30, 40, 50 yards, and then it's done. It can't go any further than that. So that's the difference really between a single lung and a double lung, and that's why penetration is exceptionally important. Now, we'll talk about penetration a little bit in here, but we're going to have to kick this down the road to really talk about how to get the penetration, because there's whole chapters in this book discussing how important it is to build your gear correctly to get maximum penetration. And I don't necessarily mean maximum penetration where you put the arrow completely out the other side, but to lacerate both lungs. And ideally, in most scenarios, putting an arrow in one side and the arrow at least coming out the opposite side. So now you have two holes, but you without a doubt know that you've lacerated both lungs. So we'll continue on. So a little more penetration will result in a clean double lung that will drop the deer in 5 to 10 seconds. An arrow that penetrates through both sides of an animal's rib cage will also result in more blood loss and loss of thoracic pressure. So that'd be that sucking chest wound, because now you got two holes in that chest. And while external blood loss is not the leading cause of death, it can help speed up recovery of an animal shot at an angle through only one lung or liver. So that's an important piece to talk about too, that the blood loss that an animal has, that it's bleeding on the ground, doesn't necessarily signify how fast the animal's going to die. I've shot some stuff through the lungs that the thoracic cavity fills up with blood but leaks very little. I've actually made some beautiful shots that have bled almost none, but they'll run 30 yards and they'll fall down dead. Then other times I've shot stuff and it's lost a tremendous amount of blood and recovered it 200-300 yards later. So the amount of blood loss that you're going to see is not indicative to how well the hit is or how fast you're going to recover it or how fast it's going to die. Because internal bleeding is a factor. What's really killing the animal is not the blood loss. In most cases, especially within a thoracic cavity kill, it's the loss of oxygen or loss of loss of oxygen, even blood flow, but loss of oxygen going to the brain, so that's going to shut everything down. So it's not the loss of blood per se, it's the loss of the oxygen, but the more blood you lose, obviously, you're going to deplete the brain of oxygen as well. So over-penetration of the arrow is certainly acceptable as well. The ideal situation is to simply put the arrow through both lungs and or the heart, and it will typically fall in sight or in hearing distance. This happens all the time. If I put something, like we said, it goes 30, 40, 50 yards, you put one through the heart or lungs, more times than not, you're either going to see it, or hear it fall. And in that case, no tracking is needed. In fact, if I don't see it or hear it fall, but I know I watched that arrow go right through the heart and lung area, I don't wait. Most people are like, well, I'm going to wait a half an hour, I'm going to do this. I don't. I just walk right the direction it went, because I already know within 50 yards it's going to be there. And 9 times out of 10, it's there. And the 10th time that maybe it's not there, it's because I saw something incorrectly. And for that, once we get to that point, we can make a decision then. Did I hit it too far forward, or maybe too high, or maybe a little too far back? There's different scenarios. That just is going to come with experience. So don't worry too much about that. Okay, so the important part here, of course, is that penetration. So when you're shooting a bow, I'm going to give you a reference point on this for what's in the book. We're not going to discuss this in detail today, but we will absolutely in the future, so make sure you come back around for that. Then we talk about the importance of penetration and shot placement, but later in the book, we actually talk quite a bit about it. We talk about the Dr. Ashby reports with kinetic energy and momentum, but also in the primitive context, that although that's good work, it doesn't apply to stone projectiles, because you're going to have a lot of extra friction with stone projectiles. Also, you're going to, so many things in this book, I mean so many things, are going to affect the penetration of the arrow based on the power that's coming out of the bow. And a couple examples, like I said, we're going to cover all these someday, is the speed in which a bow shoots an arrow, okay, and then the things that affect that speed. So we're going to give specific numbers as to how fast it should shoot. Also the distance of the shot and the arrow speed. Also the length of the draw of the bow. So somebody's got a longer draw is generally going to generate more power that's transferred into the arrow. Shorter draws typically have a smaller power stroke and less speed and less energy transferred into the arrow, although short draws are very common. We did a lot of data collecting on this. Short draws are very common, and I shoot a short draw oftentimes between 22, 23, sometimes 24 inches depending on the bow. Very short draw, but I kill a lot of animals. I compensate that through other performance metrics and weight. Also, primitive versus modern bowstrings. So modern bowstrings are going to give you more speed and efficiency and energy transference as opposed to primitive natural material strings. Moisture in the bow is going to be a tremendous factor in the speed in which your arrow flies, because the more moisture that your bow has, the less performance it's going to have, and that's going to go into a whole lot of stuff that we're going to have to cover later. Then once we get past all that, then we get into a static friction test where we do a friction test on the different sizes of stone points and then shapes of stone points, and then compare them to steel points, and that's a very eye-opening chapter. And then hafting is really important. The transition, the very smooth transition of your haft is exceptionally important for penetration, and all of these things compound. They're all little tiny variables that are exceptionally important. In fact, I have a chapter here that starts on page 28 that says the importance of each variable, because I knew what this book was going to have. I had to go back and say all of these variables work together to create the perfect set. So you could have a really, really good bow, but then have horrible stone points or a horrible hafting transition, and then get almost no penetration despite the fact that your bow has an incredible amount of energy. So like I said, this book has even more than we even discussed here. There's so much in this book, and this is why, if you're really, really interested in knowing the ins and outs of primitive hunting, that this book is so impactful. But that's also why we're going to go through every one of these chapters. You can get an idea. I'll hold it up. At least you can even pause the screen and you can see if there's any chapters here that you think are valuable to you. There are so many chapters just in this one book that are going to teach you things that will take a lifetime to learn. So, benefits of skinny arrows. So you're going to have a lot more penetration there. You're going to have, talking about arrow flight, obviously we said the transitions, small points. Most arrow points are really small. They're not great big. It's going to be another great discussion that we're going to have in the future. So, again, Secrets and Science of Primitive Archery, available at huntprimitive.com. Okay, it's the only place we sell it as of right now. We can do international if you send us an email at huntprimitive@gmail.com. We can give you a quote, but you can also get a PDF version. So if you don't want to have to mail it overseas, you can just get a PDF. That would be fine. So much information in here, but again, we're going to work through it together. But even though I read through it, there's data sheets, there's more information that I simply cannot touch on in a video alone. There's so much information that will help you get to where you want to be in your own primitive building and hunting adventures. And so I hope that this episode and this talk was enlightening, and it maybe got your wheels turning a little bit, and I hope that you have a lot of luck on your own future building and hunting adventures. And I want to see you do really well. And that's why we wrote the books. It's not to make money on the books. That's why I'm talking about it and giving the information for free on YouTube. We just want to see you be really successful. But if you don't mind coughing up $30 for a book that has a tremendous amount of information, I'm telling you, it will probably be the best $30 that you've ever spent in regards to your education on primitive building and hunting. So until the next time, again, good luck on your own primitive building and hunting adventures, and I can't wait to talk to you about one of the next many chapters in that book.
to